having been buffeted by the winds of North Norfolk last night, we've got a lovely sunny day here in Holt, a beautiful Georgian town, and we're having a meeting in an historic office. And what's interesting is the subject we're going to discuss today is a very, very modern topic indeed, and it is that of genetic modification. And I'm very lucky to have with me two very knowledgeable types who are totally opposed to the subject. First of all, I have Professor Jonathan Jones, who's a professor at the University of East Anglia, according to the information I have. He's one of the world's leading plant scientists, and he's at the John Innes Centre in Norwich, which is really world famous. And he, I believe recently, has been responsible for the introduction of the blight-free potato. Is that right?
I'm conducting a GM blight-resistant potato trial, yeah.
So I'm very, very much privileged to have you here. And I also now have Peter Melchett. Peter is a farmer, 900 acres, is that right? In West Norfolk. So he's really got his feet in the soil, and he's aptly policy director of the Soil Association. And we're going to discuss, as I've said, GM. And I just would like to tell you, this sheer chance I came across this cutting, which was in the Telegraph a week or two ago. Embrace GM if you want cheap food. Guess who said that? I couldn't believe it. The chairman of Natural England, Paul Christensen, who is a farmer. So I thought we'd ask Peter why he doesn't want us to embrace GM. We'd like to start, Peter.
Okay, I think GM is not that new now. It's been around for quite a while, and there are some newer plant breeding technologies which I think show not only greater promise, but actually have delivered more. Marker-assisted selection in particular. And I think my objections fall into two broad areas. One is that this is taking agriculture in the wrong direction. It's taking it in a direction which increases actually the use of pesticides, relies on artificial manufactured fertilizer, assumes greater intensity and scale of agriculture, and less sustainable systems, when it's generally acknowledged we need to move towards more environmentally sustainable farming with less external inputs. And it's been involved a huge diversion of funds. There are very few other research programs that have been running for about 15, 20 years. A lot of public money gone into it, where there isn't a single practical application on the ground, in the soil, on the farm, in this country at all. Most of the research programs like that have been pulled. And the second objection is that although many scientists support GM crops, the debate has been conducted, in my view, from the pro-GM side in a way that has been enormously damaging to science, which has involved the vilification of scientists who see dangers in GM crops.
Has it?
Yes. Oh, the people have lost their jobs, been threatened with the loss of jobs. In the UK, somebody was sacked, one scientist was sacked, and another was threatened that if he went on being pro-GM, he'd lose all his EU grants. This has been a pattern. Sorry?
You meant anti-GM.
You were being anti-GM.
If you were showing the dangers of GM.
Yeah,
sorry,
yes,
did I
yes.
get it the wrong way around? In any event, the scientists
Well, you do pretty well as it is.
all over the world, and the GM companies have denied independent scientists the opportunity to do research. Whenever a paper is published in the peer-reviewed literature which shows problems with GM, the response, as normal scientists would, has not been to say, let's repeat this experiment and see if they got it right. It's been to condemn the scientists and condemn the work. And I think this is, and there are other things that the side arguing for GM have done in the name of science, which actually has ignored all scientific principles and the basic wonder of science. And I think if people are more cynical about scientists, particularly scientists working for governments or industry, the pro-GM movement has a heavy burden in that. And I believe in science. I think science is wonderful. Yeah. And I think this damage to science, which the pro-GM movement has done, is a terrible legacy.
The point that you've made, thank you for assembling your argument so clearly, the point that you've made about increasing the use of insecticides.
Yeah.
Is that so?
In America, using US Department of Agriculture data, overall pesticide use has gone up. The increase has been in herbicide use. Yeah. This is since GM crops were introduced. There's been some reduction in insecticide use with the BT crops, which have a
Well, you know only too well what spraying goes on, don't you? Spraying galore. I mean, somebody told me some crops of potatoes have been sprayed 18 times.
This has been a terrible year for organic as well as non-organic farmers.
Well, no wonder people have illnesses and can't explain what they've been eating. With all these sprays and pesticides flying around. And naturally, you see, the world who don't really know as much about these things as you do, chaps, naturally think, well, GM's a good idea to increase, as this chairman of Natural England says, increase food production.
But no GM crops currently in use have increased, have even claimed to increase the yield. They're not yield increasing traits that have been inserted in any of the commercially available crops. And there's now evidence in America of what they call yield drag, because it's expensive to produce a GM crop, and it's relatively less expensive to use conventional breeding or macro-assisted selection breeding, which uses the DNA to inform conventional breeding. So you find that newer varieties, as you know, in agriculture we have new varieties coming along all the time, usually with better performance. So you're finding new non-GM varieties in practice are outperforming, out-yielding the older GM varieties. Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. Would you like to name some of them?
Well, this is true particularly in soya and maize, the two big GM crops used for animal feed and industrial uses largely, where you're finding that new varieties of soya particularly are out-yielding some of the GM varieties. There's also...
there's talk about broccoli, isn't there? Wow, a wonderful variety of broccoli. The
number of GM crops.
That's not GM.
No. And the number of GM of different crops actually grown on a large scale are very small. Soya, maize, cotton, and oilseed rape.
What about this golden rice? Isn't that a good idea in more impoverished countries of the world?
Well, there are several problems with golden rice. It's a good example of how vitriolic the debate, 12, 13 years ago, I was accused of personally being responsible for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of children in Africa and Asia going blind because Greenpeace was opposing golden rice. It's still not available. I'm not up to date with the latest where they've got to, but not a few years ago they certainly hadn't shown that they could get enough vitamin E into the rice to actually have a significant effect on the human
body.
They
certainly can now.
But then there was the question of whether the vitamin E would be absorbed by the body effectively. And the third problem, which actually one of the authors of the Green Revolution drew attention to in his book about the Green Revolution, the early one, is that there's a real cultural question about whether people will eat bright yellow rice. When I was accused of causing all this blindness, at that stage in the development of golden rice, a young person would have needed to eat a plate of rice about this high, about 2 foot high, to absorb the normal daily amount of vitamin E. And of course you can get vitamin E from lots of other sources. You don't need to get it from rice. And if you have organic agriculture where you grow a multitude of crops, not just monocultures, you get vitamin E from vegetables and other plants quite okay anyhow.
Well,
it's a solution searching for a problem, which is true of most GM crops, I would say.
Can I just pick you up on that last one, because I don't hear any arguments for campaigning strongly against golden rice. You think people won't want it? Well, why not give them the chance to find out? You think that it won't be absorbed? Why don't we find out, see if it makes a difference? Why continue to oppose it?
Because the fundamental objections to GM crops remain whatever the characteristic, the genetically engineered characteristic. The levels of scientific uncertainty, the control of farming by large chemical companies, the questions about safety, which have only grown in the 10 or 12 years.
Well, that control, if I may interrupt, that control will dissipate over the years, won't it, if it comes in?
Well, when crops come off patent, possibly, but Monsanto has kept a pretty good grip on Roundup-ready crops, including, of course, sending Pinkerton agents all over farms to see if people are cheating. It's set farmer against farmer. If from a farmer's point of view, we already worry about our output, what we produce, the price of that being fixed by a few small supermarkets, small number of supermarkets. We do not want, as a farming industry to have our input costs controlled by one or two companies. And if you look at the increase in the price of seeds in America since GM came in, cotton seeds, for example, went up about 30% over 10 years and have risen nearly 300% since GM cotton was introduced. And that's because the chemicals are in the seed and the chemical company needs to...
So in a funny way, you're not so against the plant science as you are the sort of business opportunities.
I'm not against the science at all, and none of the major opponents of GM crops are opposed to GM. We're not opposed to GM medicine. We are strong supporters of marker-assisted selection breeding,
yes,
which has delivered all sorts of very good new crops in Africa and so on. So no, there's no objection to the science.
Yeah.
My concern, as I said at the beginning, is that those in favour of GM have done things which trash the principles of science.
Yeah. Well,
okay, I think I'm sort of getting more
and more
steamed up here. But I still think you haven't made any convincing arguments against golden rice or come up with any credible defence as to why you are slowing down the deployment of something that will alleviate the vitamin A deficiency of hundreds of thousands or more of kids who currently have vitamin A deficiency. Of course, you can say, well, if only, you know, like Marie Antoinette, let them eat vegetables. But the fact is, they are vitamin A deficient because they're not getting enough vitamin A in their diet because they're very poor and they're subsisting primarily on rice. I mean, you all would agree that it's terrible that they are so poor that the only thing they get to eat is rice. But given that that is the case, why slow down the deployment of an enhanced rice, which will reduce their vitamin A deficiency?
Yes.
It seems to me inexcusable to oppose it. You make the argument about uncertainty. Uncertainty about what? I'm uncertain about what you're uncertain about. But what is very clear is that if you take a plant that's got 40,000 genes and add another gene to it, it is more identical to the plant that you started with than two different inbred lines, which may differ by many hundreds, if not thousands, of genes. So it's ludicrous to be taking the view that there's something potentially off the radar screen of damage compared to what goes on in normal plant breeding and the genetic variation that plant breeders are currently working with.
Well, what should that be?
Well, when GM started in the mid-90s, everyone involved, all the scientists and the companies, said this is a completely revolutionary, new, dramatically different, changing the world technology. Now, as health problems have started, evidence of possible health problems in humans has started to emerge, the line has changed quite significantly to, oh, this is just normal plant breeding, there's no difference, it's no more uncertain than else. But let me just answer the...
Yes.
So, I mean, I think there is real uncertainty about health impacts, and there's been a string of studies, all of which have raised the possibility that GM food affects human beings' health, the gut, a number of other internal organs, and most recently the possibility of cancer. Only possibility, but all of these scientific studies suggest that more work should be done.
Is there evidence of that, Peter?
Well, yes, there's been a systematic review, which is a scientific way of pulling together all the work that's been done by researchers. They've done 3 of these now, and looked at what the global science cumulatively says. And their last paper, which was last year, said that there have been about 30 studies. About 15 show no cause for concern, and 15, in fairly consistent ways, show some cause for concern. The 15 that show no cause for concern are all industry funded by the GM companies. The other 15 are either independent or from scientists who have a position against them.
Pesticides, following my early remarks, I'd have agreed with you. But I mean, it's interesting that you said
well, pesticides is a good point to come back, John, if I may, on this golden rice and how you feed people who are short of food. We're both very concerned about that. It's a scandal in a world which produces enough food for everyone, quite easily enough food for everyone, that there are people hungry and starving. So the question one needs to ask, I think, and which UN Development and other development charities ask themselves, is if we have enough food, how is it that we still have just under 1 billion people who are malnourished and starving? And the answer is not because there isn't enough food or there isn't a vitamin A.
Is that so?
Yes, the answer is that we don't have food at the right price in the right place for the people who are very poor, who are able to get access to that food and buy it. And why the UN development agencies and so on are all in favour of agroecological or low input systems is that they allow very poor people to grow food, mixed food, the vegetables, and I don't think Marie Antoinette did let them eat vegetables. We might all be healthier. Might all be healthier if she had, rather than let them all eat McDonald's fries. So what you need are farming systems in Africa and in parts of Asia and other places where there are very poor rural communities, are farming systems which don't rely on buying expensive inputs like fertiliser or pesticides or GM seeds, and where the fertility and the pest control and the disease control is in the soil, is in the farm. So as long as farmers save seeds, they can survive. And it's that sort of agriculture, low input, but high tech, learning from science, learning from our knowledge of the DNA, that we can see doubling of yields in African countries and so on.
Yeah, so okay, there's a lot to grapple with.
Yes, of course there is.
So first of all, on the safety of GM food, there is no credible evidence, and there's also no credible mechanism by which GM food could be any more unhealthy for you than any other food. The recent story from Serolini et al. Was statistically, it was impossible to draw the conclusions that they drew from it with any statistical credibility. There's a recent paper about which there was some publicity purporting to show that rats fed a diet with either GM soy or maize and or GMs.
But that was a scarce
Roundup plus the or nothing. They only had 10% of their animals were controls. I mean, it was. You can basically, it doesn't prove that GMs are safe, but it doesn't prove that.
But it did follow the same protocol as companies like Monsanto follow to get their GM crops through the regulatory system. The sample size was 10 rats. It's the same breed of rat, which was then criticised when they discovered a possible problem.
But not kept for 2 years. Which was a sort of
animal
health.
Sorry.
Okay, so there's no credible evidence that GM food is bad for you. Let's make an important point about GM. GM is just a method. It's like, if you're opposed to GM, it's like saying you're opposed to chemistry. You can say I'm opposed to chemistry because you can make neurotoxins with it, or you can say I'm in favour of chemistry because it's a way of processing sugar into something I want to eat. But it's just a method. And the outcome is, as I said earlier, you start with a plant with a few tens of thousands of genes, and you add another gene or a few more genes, and you know what these genes are going to do. They're going to improve a property of the plant into which they have been put. Now, the one thing that's unpredictable about current methods, or at least the most used methods, is you can't figure out where in the plant genome it's going to end up. So what you do is you screen hundreds of events, and you find an event where it's causing collateral damage, and you take that one forward. And so you actually combine it with breeding. You generate variation, and then you exercise selection for ones that you confer the trait you want and have no collateral damage.
It's an extension of plant breeding, really.
Well, I would say so, and I think this is another point I wanted to make. So Peter, in my view, posits false antitheses, right, left and centre. Of course, marker-assisted selection is an important improvement in the plant breeder's arsenal. You can, basically what it means is you find little DNA variations that are linked to a property like disease resistance or fruit quality or whatever, and it means that you can screen many more progeny with this little molecular marker rather than having to what we call phenotype them to actually do the assay to see if it's more resistant or more nutritional food. So it improves the process of plant breeding, that's great. You can select for particular combinations of traits, that's great. Although it is a problem, in fact, that we do seem to have a bit of a wheat yield plateau currently in the UK. It hasn't improved much in the last 10 years.
There is a wheat yield consortium, isn't there, that's been formed to work out the wheat yield.
Well, there's a lot. I mean, there's a big shift in the last, I guess, 3 years. and this is something Peter and I think would both welcome, is that the world's leaders have actually woken up to the fact that we can't take food security for granted. We need to care about how we raise food and to ensure security of supply and sustainability of supply. There we'd absolutely agree with each other. Where we part company is that if I'd say that sort of the fundamental difference is about the kind of agriculture we want, and I think it's an important, actually a much more interesting discussion about what kind of agriculture we want than yes or no GM. But in my view, we do need yield, and all the data that are out there say that organic farming gives you somewhere between 50 and 80% of yields of the conventional agriculture. You could argue about, I'm sure Peter would say that that's not sustainable to have the conventional agriculture, but in my view, we aim for the highest possible yields in defined areas where, and the higher the yield in those areas, the more land we can spare for wildlife
not against that,
and biodiversity.